Better Buildings for Humans is powered by Advanced Glazings, makers of the Solera line of products. Solera is the leading glass glazing made specifically for architectural daylighting and with extreme insulation performance. Learn more at advancedglazings.com.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Better Buildings for Humans podcast. I'm your host, Joe Menchefski, and this is the show where we take a look at the impact that the built environment has on our health, our wellness, our productivity, and our general joy of being alive. And of course, we have to talk about sustainability as well. And today, this is a very special episode. I don't get to talk about daylighting enough, my passion. And so I have an expert, a man with, a similar or maybe even higher level of passion for this world than me, Paul Rogers. Paul, welcome to the show. It's wonderful to finally have you here.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. Thank you very much. And I would say I probably do have a higher level of passion for this subject. I would like to just welcome to you as well, my fellow Canadian. That was kind of not often we meet other Canadians internationally like this. So it's kind of...
Yeah, Paul's in Sweden, so it was really cool to run into a Canadian in Sweden. And yeah, we're going to have some fun, and we're going to talk in depth about the sun and the magic of bringing the sun into our spaces. Paul, let's start by allowing our listener to learn a little bit about you. Tell us why you chose architecture, and tell us why you decided to go down that rabbit hole of architectural daylighting, and then tell us how you ended up with ACC and the work that you're doing now.
Yeah, I guess really, when I think about daylight and how it affected my life, I can think of that from a fairly early age. And I had a definite interest in architecture from, very long ago. Like many kids that draw, they are also interested in buildings and three-dimensional form. I was really lucky. I lived in a house that was designed by a local architect, a really good local architect, not so well known internationally, but Gustav da Rosa. So I grew up in one of these modernist sugar cubes. The windows were well shaded with fixed shading devices, and the windows were rather large, but the orientation was such that you got some really wonderful light effects. So I guess rolling into university, there wasn't too much discussion as whether I would start with fine arts or I would start with architecture, but I started with fine arts. I guess at that point I was looking at stage design or even animation. But the longer I went into fine arts, the more interested I got in all things in climate and weather, which is two things that don't normally cross. So then when I did finally roll into architecture, it was quite an interesting journey because I guess as it went on, I got less and less interested in aesthetics and more interested in the sort of energy and how it interacted with the built environment. So when it came time to do my thesis, there were many doing a glass gallery or something like this as their final project. And for some reason, I decided to bite off the topic of microclimate. I had been a TA for a number of years in the environmental controls section. And that damn thesis took me 4 years because I guess I was starting from scratch. I was working half-time as well, and I had a great apartment, but there wasn't much. It was a deep dive, and it was quite difficult because at that time, of course, in the middle of the 90s, there wasn't really the analysis tools that we have now. So everything was pretty much written in Excel, be it a sky view factor or a solar axis from the sun. So, it was a long journey, but I was quite happy how it turned out. My thesis advisor was Dr. Timothy Oak, who was the world meteorological expert in that. And I got some help from Christian Guimard down at the University of Florida with the atmospheric parameters. There was a time when you could still email professors and they would help because email was relatively new and they were just thrilled to be working with students from other universities. I don't think that works today. But when I came out, I had high ambitions, but at the same time, I wanted to work in Europe. So I had done a studio in Helsinki. So I'd liked Stockholm very much. So I came to Stockholm and I had a work permit at that time for an exchange program. And I got a job where actually one of the principals, Peter Walker, he was Canadian as well. So I was showing, I think, a lot of things in portfolio that maybe Swedish architects didn't quite understand what I was up to, but it was projects I had worked on. But Peter hired me right away, and we had basically a 20-year working relationship where the first 8 years, there was not much, if at all. I could say I would get 1 or 2 sun studies per year. And I guess it had largely to do with maybe buildings being built too close to one another, or maybe trying to figure out where solar shading was going. Of course, if I look back and revisit them now, I think it was quite off base with how I did them. But a funny thing, so I was mainly working with renderings with producing pretty pictures.
Right.
And I was just happy to have a job. But after 8 years, I started to get very tired of it. And it was sort of the opposite of what I was looking at. You, Joe, and I are very much into well, show me how this performs. So I was quite frustrated with people standing up in their thesis reviews and saying, well, this is the world's most energy efficient building, but without any calculations. So long story short, I was really lucky with timing. And around 2008, the domestic certification system here in Sweden, by the name of Environmental Building, or Miljöbyggnad, really took off. Sweden, and I guess the Nordic region in particular, but Sweden is particularly good market for environmental certification. There's a lot of interest. Much of it is driven by, in fact, the developers themselves, who are sort of upping the bar as they go, and they're very competitive sort of against one another to see who can have the most sustainable buildings. So this system, daylight, was a requirement, and you couldn't not fulfill the code requirements. It was sort of a forgotten part of the code. And my time with the renderings had taught me how to handle very big models. So that, in conjunction with the knowledge that I had from school, allowed me to make that sort of jump. And originally I was doing general certification, but it became more and more apparent that there was already in energy, there were a lot of people doing that, but there was really nobody that knew anything about daylight at that point. So I just took a deep dive and people started coming. I have to apologize. Of all the times in Stockholm at this time of year, maybe you're not getting a lot of direct sun, but that beam of light you see stretching across the stream, ironically enough, maybe it's giving me my blessing for being on your podcast, but the sun seems to want to say something, and so I hope it's okay.
It looks great. It looks just fine. It's an episode about the sun. So
yeah, so it's nice that it's along with me here on my journey.
Sure.
So anyways, I got very lucky. And then after a while, I started hiring people to give me a hand. And that was such an epiphany where after many years of sort of being alone with these, solar aspects, there were kids coming out of school, university with master's degree that knew quite a bit as well. So I found that really fantastic. And so over the years, we built up, a little very specialized business, increased it more to solar shading as well. And then I guess around 2000, we had grown to the point where it was receiving a lot of attention, and it didn't seem to align as well with the architectural firm and what they wanted to do. We were working for a lot of other architects as well. So we came to the understanding and the agreement that, well, maybe we should move everything to ACC. Now, ACC, I had previously done a lot of projects for because they had a lot of the more, should we say, higher end projects in Sweden. Often big models, complex models. And then at the time, they didn't really have anybody to help them out. So then I stepped in. It was really great. I always loved working on their projects and great people. So it made a lot of sense. ACC is very specialized with solar shading, window renovation, facade design. So it was really nice to come here and gain that knowledge in-house, because we were just sort of trying to do our best at an architectural firm, and suddenly we have all this depth. Whereas before, I'd have to pick up the phone and ask somebody at ACC for some help. Now I can just, at the lunch table or look across the workspace and get some really good answers very quickly. So quite happy that it worked out how it is. When we moved, we were a total of 5 people, just sunlight and solar shading daylight. And then we swelled up to 8 just with sunlight and daylight. Then there's a couple more here with thermal comfort and other climate-related calculations. And then with the interest rates, through COVID, we did pretty well. But then with the interest rates going up, we're back down to 5 people now again, which is pretty natural size, I think, for us. But yeah, it's been good. Now the sun is really stepping in. So I think we've got about 5 minutes. My professional opinion is there's about 5 more minutes of this, and then it will go behind the building beside us. So.
Right on. Well, let's talk about culture a little bit, culture and architecture. I've never been to Sweden. I don't know it very well, but I'm fascinated. Maybe this is a difficult question, Paul, but I'm going to take a shot. Is Swedish culture and Swedish architecture more enthusiastic about daylighting than what you would find, say, in North America? Is it more important to the Swedes, and do their architectural practices reflect that?
I would say a resounding yes. I grew up in Winnipeg, Canada, 8 hours north of Minneapolis. That's 49 degrees. Minneapolis is 43 degrees latitude. Stockholm, Oslo, Helsinki, they're all at 60. and much more cloudy. So, the winters in the Midwest, I know you're from the Maritimes, but the winters in the Midwest are actually quite cold and clear and a lot of snow traditionally. That means the air is very dry. So we have a lot of reflected sunlight off the snow. So you can get by with actually fairly small. And when people complain in Winnipeg or Edmonton, they complain about the cold. When people complain in Scandinavia, it's about the dark. It is very different. And it's one of those things that unless you've lived through a full summer of it or a full winter of it, then you don't really understand how dark it gets. So I think so we get about 6 hours of sunlight during the midwinter. Now, it often is accompanied by a very heavy cloud cover. So that's quite difficult as well. I'm just going to adjust my camera a little bit as the sun sort of tries to take over. So I just don't think most people in North America understand just how dark it gets. And I think it does to some degree in the middle of Europe as well. So for example, Germany, they may have a few more hours during the winter, but then their cloud cover is really heavy. Think more Seattle, West Coast, Vancouver. So, and then of course they've got a much more latitude. So this is in turn boiled down through the architecture. Glazing areas are much more. In particular, there are some national differences. So, for example, Iceland and Denmark have a little bit more glazing. In Sweden, there tends to be, in the last maybe, I guess it reached its apex through the 30s, 40s, and 50s, when the glazing areas were the most. And then sort of with the coming of the energy crisis in the 70s, there was sort of an attention to that. There's a period in the 80s where windows became very small. And, the frames were very wide and they had a very difficult, U value on those frames was not the best either. So you really had to restrict the whole size of the window. We had a little bit of resurgence in the 90s, but I think it went maybe a little too much coming out of the 80s with deregulation. There was a lot of problem with solar loads. And people might think, well, in Scandinavia, solar loads, does it get hot in Scandinavia? Well, the truth is the sun is quite low. So it's hitting that window almost normal fairly often. So particularly in April or May, you can get a very high solar load here. Not a lot of people realize that. So then there's again more conscious with energy going into the early 2000s, pressure to reduce window size. So I would say, yes, daylight is very much on the agenda traditionally, but there has also been this sort of pendulum which sort of swings forward and backward depending on what other focuses there are. But it's a difficult balancing act. Whereas I think in a place like North America, generally even in the northern parts of the US and southern parts of Canada, there's significantly more light during the winter season. So, I mean, how could that not boil itself down into the architecture?
Absolutely.
Do you want to bring lots of healthy, beautiful natural light in your building and still meet energy codes? Try Solera from Advanced Glazings. Learn more at advancedglazings.com.
Okay, let's talk about some of your projects. So you've worked on, the number I've got is over 1,000 daylight projects.
Yeah, I've been at it for 15 years.
Yeah.
It's around 100 per year. So I wasn't going to count them. It's a lot of beans for me to count. I still have an architect in the base, so I should probably put an engineer on that task. But
that's a lot of beans, Paul, for sure.
Yeah, I know it's well over that by now. And it's everything from somebody, whose neighbor wants to put a balcony up and wants to complain and know their rights, to large detail planning projects and everything between every scale possible. And in some ways, I like the balcony projects. The small ones are the best.
So, well, let's talk in terms of, sort of some general learnings that you might have pulled out of this. So what are the biggest, I'll say, misconceptions that architects still have about designing with natural light?
I think in general, so not just in Scandinavia, but I practice largely in Scandinavia, but I have a little bit of connection through other European countries, and US, Canada maybe is a bit different, but I think the main thing was they underestimate the effect of the surrounding buildings. So there's this feeling that even though something is dense, that they can remedy the problem through maybe minimizing balcony size or bigger windows, and that building thickness is also something that's very difficult to overcome. So you'll get a project which maybe is not conceived very well in terms of its approach to daylight. So it's highly obstructed, and then it's got a relatively thick building body. And I can see there's no way that it's going to comply regardless. And I think architects have this conception, well, with a little bit of lighter materials and there's often an overestimation of, say, how much light is reflected from adjacent buildings and stuff. But I think that's the greatest misconception, is that it can sort of be fixed afterwards, that you can pave over some bad decisions. I shouldn't say bad. I mean, all these decisions have underlying factors that contribute to them, but factors that are maybe less interested in getting good daylight out of the picture. So I think there are a few things that I do think the general knowledge of daylight amongst architects, there seems to have been a little bit of a shift in focus, maybe with some of the, I guess since electrical light has become ubiquitous. In Sweden, that happened somewhere around the 60s. There's sort of been a slow decay of daylight's priority in design, and in particular in public places. So I think it's fallen off the agenda a little bit. I think architects like their glass and they like to have bright spaces, yet quite often there's so many other factors in projects which take focus, and it can be a little bit of a surprise to them that they can't really clean it up afterwards.
I'm surprised that the pendulum swinging away from daylight these days, especially given the vast amount of research that's coming out these last few years.
Yeah, and I think what we have on the one hand is we have a greater awareness slowly growing, and that's fantastic. In Sweden, I was pleasantly surprised for Christmas when checking around 2017. I was in the back of my brother-in-law's car and we were driving the family somewhere. I don't know, to go out for lunch or something. And I came across that the Swedish Health Authority had produced a report, Light and Health. And that has gone a long way for us to sort of start, well, in particular to help the building code officials keep the quantitative requirement we have. But those key reports are really necessary to keep it on the agenda, because on the one hand, you have an increased awareness and a health concern, but then the property values, of course, and the increased urban density, that's very hard to combat. And then, of course, there's other regulations that can also cause conflict there as well. So on the one hand, I do see fewer mistakes from planning where they are not aware. There's not as much oops. But there still are neighborhoods which are extremely tightly planned, almost more than they ever have been. But there's a conscious understanding, okay, now in this instance, this is what's going to happen. So it's both good and bad. And I do feel a little bit like we need to keep at it. I was talking to Lisa Heschrong, and who you've had on the show, and Doug Mahone. And I said, sometimes I feel like I'm just pushing and pushing, and I just keep going back. Like I don't gain any ground. I don't know if I'm winning. And Doug said to me, and it's great, he said, well, think of where things would be if you didn't push the issue. And that really stuck with me. And I think we'll have times when we gain more ground. But right now, I think there's a bit of a climate of deregulation going through Europe when it comes to building codes. And so we've held our ground pretty well. I know in Norway, there's some concern about what might happen to their quantitative requirement right now. But in Sweden, with the last update, which is the final version of the code's now coming into effect, or it technically is in effect, but we'll leave the old code behind us in July 1st. We were able to get most of the things we wanted. We lost actually the requirement for direct sunlight, which was quite unfortunate. In the meeting where that was decided, I kind of pushed the boundaries of what you can say and still get invited back.
So how do they do daylighting? Is there anything in the code? Is it window to wall ratio?
I'll speak generally about the European context right now. So it's very widespread. I mean, an engineer often looks to a window to wall ratio, but that's a terrible measure for daylight because you don't get room depth and obstruction and so many other things. Although I do often use that as part of an argument to get something approved. So, for example, a project I have right now is 45% window to wall ratio, but because it's planned so tightly, I mean, the client has done essentially what they can do, right? They've gone all out. But I think what is most common in Europe, and to some degree even throughout the world, is the window to floor area ratio. So the size of the room to the glass area. It's called window, but it's really the glass area. And they tend to be around 10%, but they vary from country to country, anywhere between 6 or 15%, depending on the European country. There are some countries with the daylight factor, which is the assumed cloudy sky and the percentage of light inside as opposed to the percentage of light outside. I'll just get the window view here again. I know it's good for you to have a view, Joe. So it's good for you to have a view out.
Absolutely.
So the daylight factor, I mean, it's not great, but it's still way better than the window to floor area. Now, many of the window floor area ratio have built-in adjustments for, say, obstruction from surrounding buildings or inclusion of balconies. That's what we had in Sweden on the old version of the code. The problem with it is it only, when it assesses obstruction, because it's a simplified metric, it only looks straight forward. So you can be extremely obstructed from the sides. And if you get lucky, it's in front of you, so you don't have to, because as obstruction goes up, more glass area would be required. And that little method actually holds pretty well when you hold to all the sort of conditions of how that standard is applied, although not everybody followed all those conditions, I can say. But so that was Sweden. In the previous code, we had the daylight factor, and then we had this simplified method. And I won't say the simplified method was easier per se, but it was easier to calculate. But occasionally it allowed you to get away with something if something was in a corner. But now, of course, we see the emergence of the illuminance-based calculations, or as the Americans will be familiar with, the SDA, the Spatial Daylight Autonomy. What we have here is very similar to what's in the LM83. So the two that I know, there are 3 countries now with that. There is Iceland, which has a variation of what's in the European standard, and that's a brand new requirement just within the last year. It's kind of fun.
Yeah.
They don't have the density and they have big windows, but they still think the issue is important to look at. And I guess because they have so low light levels, they're at, I can't remember, there's Reykjavik, I think it's 64 degrees latitude or something. It's pretty high up there. And then Denmark, of course, has as part of their code now the luminance-based calculation. But unfortunately, you can also use the more simplified method as well. So people tend to hold themselves to that more simplified method. In Sweden, we have a unique situation because we have not only the national regulations, but we also have the Swedish Workplace Safety Authority, which quotes the European standard. So that allows for calculation with the SDA, or so-called illuminance-based method. So I do think as you go up the scale there, you get closer to human perception. These metrics are a little bit limited, really, but in terms of certification, I think it's better when you're using an illuminance as opposed to daylight factor, but everything's better than the wall-to-window ratio. So it sort of evolves, and it's interesting. We'd like to see, I guess, over time, convergence more on the European standard way of calculating it. And we have seen that to some degree in certification systems and in some of the national regulations.
Can you use simulation, Paul?
That's what we do, radiance. Yeah. I haven't, a little confession. I don't think I have run a simulation since maybe 2018, 17.
Okay.
My team is very good at that.
Yeah,
they use the Grasshopper and Rhino, and we've spent a lot of time writing our custom scripts. And so my job is actually mainly writing and different, report writing, motivating why things don't pass, why something can be accepted. It's been motivating strategy, I think, is where I'm. And then, of course, reviewing reports, study design. That's my job. So it is kind of embarrassing. People often ask me, what program do you use? Because they want to hear what simulation program. But in fact, I usually answer, I use Word and I use Excel and I use Outlook. That's sometimes PowerPoint. And so it's kind of maybe not quite the answer that they were hoping for. But my colleagues use primarily Rhino and Selima's Climate Studio, of course. And I know you've had Alston on. That's Alston Jakubiak. And that software is really great. So we used it as well. But we have a lot of custom stuff that we do. It depends on what the task is. And for when we do glare on aviation, so within the cockpit and then on the air traffic control tower, we have a custom written script that it's been about 8 years that we've been working on it. And it depends what the task is, really.
I'm sorry, I'm just going to go down this rabbit hole a tiny little, but what sort of altitude do these planes have to be at before, specular reflectance from buildings becomes an issue?
Now, my colleague Misho Todorov, he's the guy that really does the nuts and bolts there. But I think from about a kilometer out, it all depends on the size of the thing. Of course, if it's a small, we have in Europe that you're not supposed to exceed 20,000 candles per meter squared within the aerodome. And that's very hard to comply with.
Right.
But if it's a small thing, then the plane will pass it very fast. It won't matter. But if it's something very large, like, for example, what happened in Amsterdam with the solar farm, in front of the runways, and they had to shut down the runway. That is more significant. So at our airport here, I know there's a skylight, which is 45 degrees tilted just right. That it's a bit of an inconvenience. I think the most drastic case we had was at a hospital landing pad for helicopters, where an adjacent roof was tilted. In fact, it was probably tilted the best possible way to cause glare if you were trying to do that. So the size of the glare patch in relation to what the flight path is, their place. I mean, at a kilometer out, the plane is passing over water, and you can get glare off of just about anything. Right. So it's when you really get into that final approach that it starts to be more critical, and as you get closer and closer to the ground. So it's really a question of how long is the glare, and how bright is the glare, and how often does that glare occur. I mean, it might occur for 20 minutes in a year, or it might occur for half the time. So there's really is a weighting of different things. There's a method from the FAA, which we base ours on, and it would be nice if someone would revisit it and update it a bit, because it has its limitations. At the end of the day, what we do is, when it gets down to the materials, I go out with one of my colleagues on a sunny day, and we basically try to blind each other. You know, we start off at 10 meters, and we work our way up to 100 meters. And it is really great. If you hit it right, you can really do a job. But there's nothing that the computer is going to pop out an answer, right? It's things you have to sort of take a line of inquiry, and that's where the study design comes into it. Each study is different. There are push button solutions, but they're not very good, and they certainly don't go into the depth that we think things should go into. But I would say anything within a kilometer of an airport, a major airport, should be checked.
Okay, changing gears a little bit here. Let's talk about sort of form and thing. You see a building for the first time, or you enter a building for the first time. What signs on that building would show you that the architect was contemplating and thinking about natural light entering the building?
Yeah, I think ultimately there's this tendency to think that as a daylight specialist, we just want a lot of daylight. That couldn't be further from the truth. What we would like is control over daylight. So, I mean, it can't be overheating. It's got to be free from glare, or glare only limited periods. In terms of daylight, I would look at uniformity. So there's not a lot of contrast within the room. But I mean, ultimately, it comes down to sufficiency and control. So sufficiency, is there enough? And then uniformity, what's its quality? And then, of course, just the control aspect of it, which is the glare and overheating. But it really depends on what the architect is after. There's a really great article on one of the Daylight and Architecture editorials where they looked at the architect Sigrid Leverets, the Swedish architect, and then how daylight is handled in his church buildings against Alvar Aalto, the Finnish architect, and how daylight is handled in his building. So Leverets was very much about darkness and puncturing points of light. Think about almost like Le Corbusier-Ronchamp, this dramatic light, whereas Aalto comes in and he spreads this kind of uniform blanket of light. I tend to prefer, those spaces are certainly good for offices and what else. And so it depends a little bit on what the function is. But I would say churches are very special buildings. But I would say for most buildings, you're looking for the Aalto approach, where you're getting a very uniform distribution of light. In my house, it's a wonderful building design from the 50s. It's a row house, typical of the sort of Scandinavian 50s. So it's a split level. And there's a time of the day when the light comes in the front of the house, and our living room is downstairs, and it's on a bit of a cliff. So light comes down through the stairway into the living room. The living room's not deep, and it has a horizontal window band. So you've got a lot of light coming in from the north, which is nice and blue, and very good. So normally the daylight factor in there would be maybe 3.5. But then you also get this shot of light maybe for an hour down that staircase and diffusing off that tall, that 2.5-story wall. So there's a time when the room is actually lighter from the back than it is, at the front of the room. And you've got this wonderful mix of warm light. And so I think there's an example of an architect thinking of like connecting light between rooms. There's a higher level. So that's the sort of thing I'm looking for. Often with daylight, we don't want it to come in straight and hit you in the face, because we'd prefer it to come in at an angle where it's hitting something and diffusing and giving that wonderful diffuse light. So that's the sort of signals that I'm looking for. Is a lot has to do with orientation and really working a little bit in harmony with that solar path during this time of day. And there are tools you can use to figure out how, these solar angles. And certainly that's next level stuff. That's what I look for, I guess, is the sort of connection of light between rooms and uniformity. And the glare is certainly within that conversation there because there isn't so much glare.
Right. Diffusion is the answer for uniformity for sure.
Blinds, the ultimate design feature. Nothing says architectural vision like a building covered in slats and cords, right? Of course not. Everyone hates them. They're fiddly inside and ugly outside. So why plan for them at all? Solera gives you glare-free daylight, no blinds required. Clean, simple, and exactly what you wanted people to see in the first place. Let's work together. Visit advancedglazings.com to get started.
I want to talk about your work with the European Daylight Standard, Paul,
Yeah.
if we can. In 17307, you were heavily involved there. Can you tell us a little bit about your role and what you were pushing for and what the outcome ultimately?
Yeah. I am one of 5 from Sweden. Each country is allowed a representative. The committee is fairly heavy on Sweden and Denmark.
Yeah.
You would expect that. I am particularly active on the committee. There may be 6 of us that do the majority of, say, the writing and the studies and things like that. So I would see my contribution is primarily to give an industry perspective. There, I think academia is very well represented on the committee. So to give where the rubber meets the road, or maybe I might say the little pawns are out in the field doing the battle every day, that's the feedback that I can give. How it's received by the customers, how it works in practice over these hundreds of projects. I also, Jens Christoffersen is our committee chair. I think you know him as well. He's been on your. I really work to support him. He is an excellent chair and he can't do everything himself. So Helle Rasmussen from Denmark and I really try to give the support that he needs to keep the committee running effectively. So that's maybe a little more administrative, but that is a role I enjoy. There are committee members, Jan Weinold and John Mardalevich. I mean, I'm in awe of them. I don't have that kind of knowledge. So it really works. There aren't too many places where I can go and just learn about daylight from courses online. It's like I don't want to say master's course. It's just this highest level discussion. And quite frankly, I don't always understand everything. I usually say, I want you to put this so simply that a Canadian can understand it. But it's some impressive stuff, and I've learned a lot through it. So my involvement in it is one of the best parts of my job, really. But I do also feel in reverse that the practitioner, that my perspective is valued highly. And that's really a great experience. So there is also this started discussion of this ISO standard, which I think would be very interesting as well. So that's in the works. But we're looking to revise the standard. The recommended levels, which were previously prescribed, were quite high, very difficult, particularly in multifamily residential. I was one of the authors on a paper recently that looked at the Swedish context, and we could see that the ability to fulfill the regulation is tough. And I think that's one of the things that's really hindered its adaptation. You go from country to country, and there's variations of the same story where they wanted to do it, but then they looked at the recommended levels and they backed away. So there you can expect a change in how that is set up. And then I would say there's some minor changes to calculation method and perhaps some few new things here and there. But I think it's really the recommended levels that were perceived to be quite ambitious. In particular, the highest level is very hard to. I had to show what I was talking about. We assessed Le Corbusier's Villa Savoie. We didn't include any, so it doesn't have any. So
how did he do?
It didn't. The main room, it didn't pass the highest. It
Right.
had a little dark corner, so it didn't. So we've all come to the conclusion there that something had to be done there. So I think that's the main thing. But it's quite exciting. The first iteration of the standard, I mean, to get everybody to agree and to get something out was quite an accomplishment. But I do think there's definitely room for further work. And a little bit like when we're done this round, we're already starting to talk about, well, there's a bit of a time constraint now, but we're already talking about, well, on the next round, what are the things that we would like to look at. I mean, climate data is another area that we're starting to see has some limitations. So there's lots of good stuff. I know the glare section that Jan Weinhold's been working, he's mainly been in charge of that section. There's some fine tuning there as well. But it's certainly interesting to see. It was quite clear that the different aspects, so there's 4 aspects that stand. There's daylight, sunlight, view, and glare. That the daylight was far more ambitious than the other aspects. So that's what we're editing, the recommended levels.
Okay, Paul, so with regards to, the codes and the standards that are being developed, do you see any kind of movement towards wanting to enhance those codes to speak to full spectrum natural light, right? I mean, there's just so much information out there now. We know that we need that 480 nanometer for circadian entrainment. They're starting to see, that the infrared and the long wave reds that we take away from LEDs are having some serious implications. Even the UV and some of the shorter wavelength violets, they're now connecting that to the myopia epidemic. Yeah. So we're finding out that full spectrum light is actually essential to life.
Yeah.
Is that going to start reflecting in codes or standards, do you think?
Like you, followed this discussion. There was in that document that I mentioned from 2017 from the Swedish Health Authority, there is sort of that mention in passing, but of course so much has happened since 2017. That document really needs to be rewritten. And I think it's maybe similar to many other countries. I think Sweden maybe is on the forefront of the issue. And so if we haven't got there yet, then, and I do think we're quite a ways away. When I've raised the issue, particularly of the IR, to glazing companies, and they've been taken quite by surprise. And the reaction was actually quite negative in terms of, well, we want to see the science. And I still think, while we suspect a lot of things, the fact that nothing is conclusively proven, I mean, it's a bit like smoking. How long did it take to prove that? So unfortunately, I think we're quite a ways away. I mean, we're still, when it comes to compliance, we're still kind of pounding 2 stones together with daylight factor or window area. I mean, there's other metrics that we could be using, which are much more sophisticated, built on, of course, vertical illuminance. But we're quite far away from that. It's fairly conservative, taking on new ideas. But I would like to see more discussion of it. I do bring up the issue of glazing clarity and getting a full spectrum, particularly when housing is involved, because there's a bit of a trend in Scandinavia. We have, in many of these Scandinavian countries, we have some sort of legislation which protects the homeowner against overheating. So there's a tendency there to want to do the most simple solution possible, which is not the best solution. So rather than, say, have an interstitial blind, which has for a long time been the solution here in Scandinavia, the complaint is, well, we have to maintain them and they fall apart and all this, so we have to purchase them. So there's a tendency, well, we want to just solve this forever. We want to put in a solar protection glass. Okay, well, not only does that muddy down the daylight, but of course, then you're getting no IR at all. So I've started to talk a little bit to the customers that I've been working with for a long time and trust, and just say, well, you know that this is an aspect that it's not really proven, but it's one of these things we should probably keep in the back of our minds. When we come to offices, though, or commercial buildings, it's harder, that argument, because of course the internal loads are greater and the cooling is more of a, at least in Scandinavia tend not to ventilate office buildings quite the same way you do in housing, just open a window. And it's really created a difficult conversation, which you have to be careful where you bring it up so you don't be perceived as, well, quite frankly, some kind of nutter. It's quite unfortunate.
Yeah.
And it's got to be framed in a proper manner. And I do think it's something that we have to, over the long term, warm our clients up to, because for the longest time we've been saying, well, this is the way you do it. And now to sort of backpedal and say, oh, by the way, that this is making us sick. And of course, science grinds away slowly. The scientific method grinds away slowly to prove things conclusively. So I think it's a responsibility of us professionals to bring it up, but particularly with the glazing manufacturers themselves. But I think it would be nice if they started to understand. But I don't see that yet. I wish I did, but it's still something you're walking a little bit on eggshells.
Yeah. Well, I mean, 25 years ago, nobody believed that there was any, that the tie to the circadian rhythm that was healing crystals and
Yeah.
that kind of that sort of level of science. So it was dismissed. Now it's mainstream knowledge, and I suspect the other issues will follow the same sort of trajectory over time. All right, we're near the end, and I want to ask my $1 million question. So, Paul, there's a question I ask every episode, and I ask the guests to answer it from whatever perspective you'd like. And that $1 million question is, what makes a great building?
Yeah, I mean, when I think of a good building, foremost I think of the qualities of fresh air, good acoustics, light, pleasant temperature. Those are foremost to me. And that's my bias, right?
Yeah.
I mean, ultimately, then, is it suited to its purpose? How do the occupants feel about that? I think when I came out of school, I had this kind of still a little bit combative focus on energy, that energy should be, saved at all costs and people should not worry. It's fine. But then now I've done 180 degrees. And it's funny how you can be in the environmental camp, but you can be in different camps. So my viewpoint is that it's incredibly important to focus on the user and their biological needs, and then the fitness for the building to do whatever task it is. Because ultimately, we're not doing this for the well-being of the building, we're doing it for the well-being of the people. And the buildings, there's so much discussion now about actually an embodied energy that goes into building the building. It's not just the energy use. That we have buildings that were all over the world ill-suited, and then they get torn down after 20 years. And that's probably the least environmental thing that could happen. So when I think good building, I also think longevity, and is it valued by the people? And then that goes back to the buildings that tend to be valued by the people are the ones that have good light, fresh air, controlled acoustics, and a pleasant temperature. That's a pretty good start. I mean, there's an aesthetic component as well that can't be denied. But I think if you start taking care of those things in the beginning, then you probably stand fairly well. So that's my definition from my little cubby hole, what I would focus on.
I love it. All right, Paul, before we go, do you have any announcements, any sort of upcoming events or anything that you'd like to share?
Yeah, as normal, I got a few things on the go, a couple of workshops and things coming up. But I think foremost from the Swedish Code Authority, it's funded. It's together with 3 other authors. We're updating our sort of survey of the current state of the art of daylight in Sweden. So it's a bit of an industry assessment as well. And this is in the context of the updated building code. We did one previous, and now we're updating it. I was just on the Sunlight podcast, and I know you have been as well, and you've had Georg here
with Georg
as well.
Yeah.
We actually had the opportunity, we went down to my second house in Alicante, Spain. So we did, what would you call it, in person, on location, in the sun there on the sun terrace. So that should be out maybe in about 3 weeks. So I guess towards the end of the end of March, beginning of April. In there, we talk about the buildings that we've known, both good and bad, and how it has affected us. It was a lot of fun. Dave got a bit of a sunburn, so you can watch him getting a sunburn.
The Brit got a sunburn. Who'd have thought?
You can watch Dave get a sunburn over the course of the podcast, so that's good. Then I guess foremost, I would like people to be aware of the European standard and the first review copy. We're expecting that will be out probably early 2027. I don't know if we'll get to later this year, but somewhere around there, I guess in the first quarter of 2027 is probably a realist. So that's the public's first chance to review and comment. Very important time. Oh, and I should also give a shout out for the Enlighted Summer School. I don't know, are you familiar with that?
Yeah, I am familiar, but not everybody is. So
yeah,
please.
It's an Erasmus, a European funded program where we get together for a week. It's 4 different universities, and we have an intensive daylight boot camp. I've been involved for all 4 years. I don't know, to tell you the truth, if we're going to do it again this year. Last year was amazing. It was in Venice and Trento and a small mountain town in northern Italy. Just amazing. But the students are master's students or higher doctoral students as well. And then we have sometimes people from industry. And it's a week of fairly intense discussion about it. So I have to give a shout. It's just such a great thing. So I don't know if it's on, but I think people can search for it. It's NLITED. So if you're interested in daylight, then that's something you can take a look at.
Perfect. Paul, thank you so much for making time to do this. It's been a wonderful experience.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it.
I learned a lot, and I'm sure our listeners will learn a lot too. Thank you very much.
Great.
Take care.
Thank you, Joe. Cheers.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Better Buildings for Humans. For more information on the world's best light diffusing and highly insulating glass glazing, please visit advancedglazings.com.